Thank you, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Workshop, first meeting of the year in person. And it's great to see a great turnout here today. My name is Brenda Crona, I'm here from the Stakeholder Affairs Group. Today, I'll be helping facilitate this call, as well go over a few meeting reminders to kick things off. The meeting reminders is that this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. As well, Michelle, if you can move to the second slide. Um, Today, my event producer, Michelle, will be helping me with a few, helping with the chat as well with the raise hands icons in the next slide. So to ask us a question, make sure we have two ways. So for those that are in person, we do have mics that we could pass around. Be sure to state your name, affiliation before speaking. And then for those who are virtual participation only, we do have the raise hand icon that is located in the middle bottom of the screen. It's no longer located above the chat window, so be mindful of where it's located. And feel free to submit a chat questions to all panelists. We'll be reviewing those and I'm gathering responses to everyone in the group. But other than that, we will get started. On the next slide, I'm gonna go ahead and introduce James. And we also have Gabe here who's gonna be help facilitate, as well as Michael, who's also online virtual. He will be able to speak in and go ahead and let's kick things off with James. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda, and thanks everyone for joining today. So, yeah, I'd just like to reintroduce our team first. So I'm James Friedrich with the CAISO's policy team, and I'm going to be managing this price formation enhancements project. And this is the third in a series of workshops that we've done to, the first workshop focused a little more on price formation principles, and we discussed some price formation basics, walking through some examples to give folks the foundation that they needed to sort of follow along with this initiative. The second price formation workshop sort of narrowed in a little bit closer on fast start pricing, and that's sort of the topic that we've been talking about in these sort of pre-initiative workshops. And so this third workshop will introduce, for discussion purposes, a proposed mechanism to incorporate fast start pricing into the CAISO market. And again, this is a mechanism for discussion purposes, which is essentially is to say that this is not a CAISO formal proposal, but it's intended to stimulate discussion and provide sort of a initial framework that we can use to base ourselves on and debate the merits as we move forward into the more formal policy process later into the year. So I would like to note, just in terms of timing, that we're planning on kicking off the formal policy development process here in Q2, probably around the early summertime, in which you would expect to see sort of a straw proposal for price formation enhancements that overlaps not just fast start pricing, but some of the other price formation topics that are in this phase, including scarcity pricing and also consideration of BA level market power mitigation for the EDAM. So that's what's to be expected in the next couple of months. We'll also are considering after this workshop, we may potentially have a fourth workshop in the series if needed to sort of fill in some gaps that we didn't cover in this set of slides. And then the ISO is also considering looking into more sort of an empirical look at the assessment and need for fast start pricing in the CAISO market. That gets us away from more of the these price examples, but more into what problems we might be trying to solve and able to solve in the CAISO market to sort of lead us into the next discussion of whether or not the ISO makes a formal proposal for fast start pricing. Okay, so I'd just like to pause to ask if there's anybody that has any questions about process before we get into the material. Okay, looks good. So once again, before I begin, I have Gabe Murtaugh here with me in the room, who can help me with some questions if needed. Mike Cadwilator, who's from Atlantic Economics, is joining us, and I introduced Mike a few workshops ago. Mike's been helping the ISO in this very important question about how can we make fast start pricing potentially work given the issues that the ISO has argued against in the past. And Mike's been really critical in helping us come up with some, potentially workable designs here. So thanks, Mike, for that. And I believe we have Guillermo Bautista Alderete online, who's also in the panelist list. So if we have potentially some empirical questions come in, Guillermo can help us with that. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So similar to previous workshops, this discussion is going to be based off of examples that hopefully are familiar if you've been following along with these workshops, but we're trying to keep the examples as consistent as possible so that, when you're reviewing the material and you're going back after this workshop's over to reassess, there's some consistency, so there's not a struggle both to learn the material itself, but also to learn what's changing in the examples. So we're going to be talking about two examples today in this workshop. Both of them are based off of CAISO's supplemental comments in the fast start pricing NOPR proceeding, which if you're interested in reading those supplemental comments, the link is provided here below. I do also want to point out that acronyms on the slide as they appear for those that aren't familiar with CAISO jargon, which is many of us. I tried my best to, in the footnote of each slide, anytime I introduce a new acronym, I spell out the acronym. So hopefully that's helpful. So the examples that we're going to go through today essentially walk through a proposed mechanism intended to prevent or to introduce fast start pricing into the CAISO's market, while at the same time prevent the undermining of the flexible ramping product price. So you would simultaneously assume that fast start generators are dispatchable below their minimum output level, while also attempting to maintain the FRP price signal. And we'll demonstrate how that might be done in the examples. I do want to point out that the discussion of fast start pricing in the context of these examples is limited to the fact that we're assuming fast start generators are dispatchable below their minimum output and does not yet consider incorporation of commitment costs into the LMP price signal. So that's sort of a different component of fast start pricing that we may eventually dedicate another workshop to. But essentially what we're trying to show is just isolate can we solve this sort of oil and water problem of flexible ramping product and fast start pricing. And we can get into commitment costs into LMP at another time. And a big reminder to sort of level set us before we get into the examples, and actually the examples themselves will demonstrate exactly this point. But the historical issue with fast start pricing in the ISO's market context is that because we have multi-interval optimization in real time and a flexible ramping product that prices based on the need to position resources up or down to meet sort of uncertainty in the upcoming dispatch. The marginal cost of repositioning these units would have been zero in the pricing run of the binding interval, even though there is a need to reposition these generators. That need actually exists in the scheduling run. And because of the assumptions of fast start pricing, essentially remove that cost from consideration and limit the FRP price signal. So we'll sort of see that again in the examples as we walk through them. Okay. I believe I have control of the slides. Let me see if I can do, okay. Sensitive mouse, okay. So here's essentially the alternative approach to implementing fast start pricing for discussion purposes. Essentially what we're doing is in the binding interval, which is the current interval that we're solving for, fast start generators will be assumed as though they can operate at any level between 0 megawatts and their maximum output level, which is the classic fast start pricing assumption that essentially if they have an operating range that or a range below their Pmin that's inoperable, the fast start pricing essentially assumes that physical constraint away in the pricing run. And then in the advisory intervals, which in these examples, we'll only consider one advisory interval. So we'll be solving for the current binding interval and then one interval into the future. The pricing dispatch will assume they can operate at no less than their minimum output level. So essentially, only in the binding interval do you assume that the fast start generator can operate between 0 and its max. And then in all of the advisory intervals, you essentially maintain the physical characteristic of that resource that they can operate no less than their minimum output. Okay. So to distinguish between the examples that you're going to see, like I said, we're going to have two examples. Example one shows that, or has an example where the fast start generator does not operate in the binding interval. So what we're going to see is that, sort of previewing the punchline here, that the alternative fast start pricing approach essentially produces flexible ramping product prices that reflect the marginal opportunity costs, whereas ordinary fast start pricing would not. And I'll sort of get into what these terms ordinary fast start pricing and alternative fast start pricing mean on the next slide. And then the second example essentially has the fast start generator operating in both the binding interval because it's needed to meet load in the binding interval, and then also running in the advisory interval. And the punchline essentially is that the alternative fast start pricing approach would permit the fast start generator's offer to set the LMP, the energy LMP, while the FRP prices continue to reflect the marginal opportunity cost. So I'm gonna set up the assumptions of the example before I'll pause to see if there's any clarifying questions before we get into the actual numbers here. But the assumptions for the examples setup will be similar to previous ones, in which we have 3 generators who are offering supply. We have one fast start generator that's labeled FSG, and then we have G1 and G2, which are assumed to be non-fast start generators. G1 and G2, while not fast start, are committed to operate in the binding and advisory intervals of both examples. So essentially, we need the supply from G1 and G2 in all cases. Now, the fast start generator can be started whenever to meet load. And in the first example, it's only needed in the advisory interval. In the second example, it's needed in both. This table right here shows various assumptions that will be carried out through the examples. The resources have wide variations in their ramp rate, which you can see generator 1 having a relatively slow ramp rate and generator 2 have a relatively fast ramp rate. Ramp rates in this context are going to be in units of megawatt per minute, but I want to be clear that in the examples, the intervals themselves will be assumed to be 5-minute intervals. So you can assume that these ramp rates multiplied by 5 represent the amount of ramp that can be obtained from each unit interval to interval. The Pmin and Pmax, which is the minimum and maximum operating characteristics of these resources, are given in the following columns. Note that generator 2, we will change their Pmin and Pmax assumptions slightly in the examples to change what we're trying to show. And then in terms of energy offers, this will remain consistent, where you have generator 1 offering energy at $25, generator 2 offering at $30, and the fast start generator offering at $35. As has been pointed out in previous examples, we need to assume away the presence of market power or any sort of non-cost-based bidding going on here to have these examples make sense. So for purposes of these examples, just to clarify, we're going to assume that the energy offers actually represent the marginal costs of that unit. There will be no discussion of startup costs, either in the examples or generally, as I've already mentioned, in terms of getting startup and commitment costs into the energy LMP. And finally, generators are dispatched to minimize cost while meeting a forecasted load and upward and downward uncertainty. So what we're going to see is you're going to have a binding interval load and an advisory interval load that the resources have to be positioned to meet, plus or minus some threshold of upward and downward uncertainty that represents the flexible ramping product targets. Okay, so I'm going to get into a few more details for example one, and then I'll pause to make sure there's no questions on the assumptions before we actually get into the material. So this is similar chart or similar table to the one on the previous slide, except that it fills in red generator two's minimum and maximum output assumptions, or their Pmin and Pmax. So they have a relatively limited range here between 320 and 345 megawatts, which essentially means that the generator 2 cannot operate less than 320 megawatts in any interval, or greater than 345 megawatts in any interval. And again, generator 2 is not assumed to be a fast start generator, and so those characteristics will remain pretty static. So in terms of the load assumptions, we're going to have a binding interval load requirement of 825 megawatts, an advisory interval load expectation of 855 megawatts. So the load is growing as the time is going on. And we're also going to have uncertainty requirements of plus or minus 20 megawatts. So essentially the optimization has to set up the resources to be able to meet uncertainty requirements of plus and minus 20 megawatts, while also setting them up to meet the advisory interval load expectations. I'll pause there to make sure there are no, actually, I think I might have one more slide. Oh yeah, so just a little more terminology before we get into the numbers. So remember that fast start pricing requires one to separate the physical dispatch from the pricing dispatch. And so I did want to insert some KISO terminology here that when you hear the words physical dispatch, you might think of that in KISO language as scheduling run. That's kind of how we think of it. I think I'm going to try to use the term physical dispatch as much as I can to make it more general. And then pricing dispatch is essentially synonymous with the KISO's pricing run. So, that if I mix up that language a little bit, come back to the slide and remember that they're synonymous. But I'm going to try to use the terms physical dispatch and pricing dispatch as best I can. So then when you see the term in the examples where it says status quo physical dispatch, which will show up in gray underneath the title of the slide, it's what you're seeing in that part of the example is that this is representing the prices and dispatch that would result from the status quo KISO market solution. Okay, but this would also be, in a fast start pricing sense, also be the physical dispatch solution under the fast start pricing method. So when you see status quo physical dispatch, it's both the current KISO market process in terms of dispatch and pricing, but also represents what would be the actual physical dispatch for those units. Because remember, in the fast start pricing scheme, you send out physical dispatch instructions to generators based on the physical dispatch run or the scheduling run, and then you send out the prices that result from those that dispatch in the pricing run or pricing dispatch. When you see the term pricing dispatch, ordinary fast start pricing is representing the pricing dispatch solution under ordinary fast start pricing. So essentially not with this characteristic where we're only operating the fast start generator below its minimum output in the binding interval, but also be able to operate below minimum output in the advisory interval as well. And then when you see the term pricing dispatch, alternative fast start pricing, that intends to represent the pricing dispatch solution under alternative fast start pricing. So within each example, we're going to go through these 3 steps. So in total, we're going to have more or less 6 examples. So we'll come back to these this terminology in case it's not clear, or if you're confused about which calculation we're running, refer back to slide 9 and check out these definitions here. And you'll see under these things under the title slide. Okay. So we're going to get to the next slide has the starts the numerical examples. I just want to give the audience a chance to ask any clarifying questions before we begin. Okay, so let's begin. Sorry, I have a happy mouse, so I'm accidentally skipping slides. Okay. So here we are on slide 10. So this is the first example where the fast start generator does not operate in the binding interval. And again, this gray italicized text under the title represents which part of the calculation we're in. So this is the status quo example to show how the CAISO market today would price and dispatch these resources according to these conditions, but also would represent in a fast start pricing scheme the physical dispatch that would be sent out to generators. So the table is organized in the following fashion. Anything in blue represents the assumptions that we've seen in the previous slide. So this is going to give you the resource name, the Pmin and Pmax, the ramp rates, and the energy offers. So these just come from the previous slides. On the right-hand side of the screen in orange will be the results of the optimization. So what you'll see under the binding interval column is the energy schedule in megawatts for each of the resources, but also the flexible ramp up and down awards that are calculated in the binding interval for those resources. And then in the far right column, you'll have the advisory interval schedules, which will be the energy schedules that would be sent out as advisory schedules for the first advisory interval. So hopefully that, that's going to be consistent throughout the examples. So that's how the table is sort of organized here. So then another point is that within each table, I try to highlight in red numbers within the table to focus on for this particular slide. So anytime you see red numbers here, it means that I'm trying to attract your attention to specific quantities within the table so one hopefully doesn't get too lost when looking at this big table and trying to interpret it. Because we'll try to walk you through what's important from this table the best we can. So the first thing to say here is that the Pmax of G1 and G2 are highlighted in red. And what we're trying to show is that because G1 and G2 have a combined capacity of 845 megawatts, the fast start generator must be started in the advisory interval to meet the advisory interval load of 855 megawatts there in the bottom corner. So this is why the fast start generator is needed in the advisory interval, but it's not necessarily needed in the binding interval. So you're going to see, if you follow the fast start generator's energy schedule, it's got a 0 energy schedule in the binding interval because it's not needed to meet load. Okay. So next, looking for the red text in the table, we're looking at the energy schedule for generator 1 in the binding interval. So keep in mind that generator 1 has a maximum output of 500 megawatts, but in the binding interval is restricted to a production of only 490 megawatts. And that's because G1 must be able to reduce its output to 480 megawatts in the advisory interval and can only change its output by 10 megawatts an interval, which is, again, as I mentioned earlier, the ramp rate of 2 megawatts per minute times these are 5-minute intervals we're considering. So it can only move 10 megawatts per interval. And it's needed to be able to be dispatched down to 480 because there's some downward uncertainty here. And there's no other combination of setting these resources up that would enable these resources to be able to meet that downward uncertainty if it materialized. So that's why you see in the binding interval, generator 1 has a flexible ramp down award of 20 megawatts because it can from 490, it can ramp down to 480, but you can also get flexible ramp because in the advisory interval schedule, they're intended to ramp up 10 megawatts. So the market could get downward ramp capability between these two intervals by simply just not ramping generator 1 up to 500. So the sum of that is the 20 megawatt award. So just to revisit this, the reason why this 490 megawatts is important is because when the next slides, when we look at the energy LMPs, generator 1 is not being dispatched to its full capacity when it's in the money. So it's incurring some sort of cost to be held back by these 10 megawatts when it's in the money relative to its energy price or energy bid. So let's take a look at that. So here the red highlighted numbers are showing you the energy offer from generator 2, which is the marginal generator in this condition, where if you needed an additional unit of load in the binding interval, one would get it from generator 2. So we think back in workshop number 1 when we introduced this topic of marginal cost and how we identify which unit is needed to serve the next increment of demand. And in this case, it's generator 2. Its energy offer sets the marginal price in this case. So you would have a $30 energy LMP under these conditions. And since G1 cannot increase its output in the binding interval and maintain its ability to decrease its output to 480 megawatts in the advisory interval, just in case the FRD showed up, that means that even though generator 1 has some upward headroom here, it's being restricted from going any higher than 490 because it needs to be able to ramp down. So again, revisiting this point that generator 2 is setting the locational marginal price of $30. Generator 1 is in the money, which is a term to mean that its energy offer is lower than the energy LMP, which you would expect if they were sort of self-scheduling themselves. They would want to be in the market for all 500 megawatts of its capacity. So this 10 megawatts that you're holding G1 back is representing some cost that you're going to have to compensate G1 for this characteristic. Okay, slide 13. We're going to highlight here in red now a look at how the flexible ramp down marginal price is calculated. So we're going to start with this down in the very bottom row. We have moved the flexible ramp down number from 20 to 21 to see where the incremental unit of flexible ramp down would come from in this case. And one would have to get the flexible ramp down from generator 2 because generator 1 cannot possibly provide more than 20 megawatts of flexi ramp down because of its ramp rate. So what would happen is that you would have two changes here. One is that in the binding interval, it necessitates a change in the binding interval because generator 1 actually has to be dispatched 1 unit lower such that generator 2 can provide a unit of that flexi ramp down. So in doing this, you're actually incurring a cost in the dispatch of 5 megawatts. And the reason that happens is because generator 2 has a 5 megawatt or $5, I should have said $5, not 5 megawatts, sorry. Generator 2 has a $5 cost, incremental cost of $5 relative to generator 1. But there's also a change in the energy schedule that happens in the advisory interval because now that generator 1 has been withheld another unit of energy, it's also being withheld for another unit of energy in the advisory interval, which now it can't meet its full capacity because it has a ramp rate restriction. So now there's an additional $5 cost in the advisory interval. So in total, the opportunity cost that generator 1 faces in providing flexi ramp down is $10 per megawatt hour because it incurs $5 of cost in the binding interval and $5 of cost in the advisory interval. So I think that's good. Then let's go to the next slide where we have flexible ramp up. Now, in this case, where you're looking at the red numbers in the table, we're assuming an additional unit of flexi ramp up is needed, and you would get that from generator 2, and you can do this costlessly. So the flexi ramp up marginal price in this situation would be 0 because an increase in the upward uncertainty has no impact on the energy schedules. So you don't have to reposition relative to a flexi ramp up requirement of 20. You don't have to reposition these units in their energy schedules to procure an extra unit of an upward uncertainty. So therefore, the flexi ramp marginal price is $0. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and ask the audience if there's any part of that example they want me to walk through again before moving on to the next part.
We can go ahead and unmute Michelle Keto from CPUC.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto. I have a slightly different question, but it is sort of related to this. Have you actually looked at your fleet to see whether you're ramp constrained on the gas units?
So it's a good and important question. So I'm not going to be able to answer that on this call, but what I can tell you is that in preparation for a straw proposal, the ISO would be seeking to answer or look into some empirical and analytics on questions like you just asked, to get at some of the more of the empirical justification for flexi or fast start pricing. Nothing in these examples is intending to gloss over that important question, but it is just to demonstrate that, the purpose of these examples is just to demonstrate if one wanted to pursue fast start pricing and at the same time maintain the FRP price signal, how could it be done?
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Michelle.
Oh, sorry, but just to be clear, if you did do a straw proposal, this is the kind of data you would provide to parties?
Yeah, so that the metric that you just mentioned and sort of a look at the fleet, both sort of in the ISO and I guess widely across the EIM would be part of that assessment.
Okay. Okay, and then just to be clear, most storage has, infinite ramp rates, isn't that right?
I believe that's true.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, they would be able to, their ramp rates would be infinite and they would be able to provide flexi ramp up and down for as the maximum quantity that they can produce in a 5-minute interval in this case. So that's what would represent their upper and lower bound, or upper bound on flexi ramp down and flexi ramp up capability.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a question in the room.
Hi, James. Brian Thaker with Middle River Power. You probably covered this, so I'm a little reticent to ask, but in the binding interval, G2 has got an energy schedule of 335, 21 megawatts of FRU, but its Pmax is 345. I don't understand. Maybe I'm missing. How can the sum of those two things be greater than the Pmax of the unit?
Yeah, so that's a great question and something I should walk through slowly in this example. So the reason why it can provide up to 20, in this case 21 megawatts, is that if you compare its binding interval schedule of 335 to its advisory interval schedule of 320, it's forecasted to move down 15 megawatts. So flexi ramp quantity comes from two places. It's either the opposite movement of where you're scheduled to go in the next interval, which in this case allows this unit to provide 15 units of flexi ramp up, but then also the ramp capability up to its Pmax. So from a position of 335 and with an advisory interval schedule of 320, this resource could provide up to 15 plus 10, 25 units of flexi ramp up. And similar, and if I may add on to that example, G1 is in a similar position where it's only able to ramp 10 megawatts per minute, 10 megawatts per interval, but it has a flexi ramp down schedule of 20, which comes from the same concept that it's forecasted to move up in the advisory interval, which allows it essentially to provide 10 megawatts of down just by not moving up to 500 in the next interval. Any other questions on the phone? Okay, so we'll move on now. Okay, so in the upcoming example, so I'm sort of throwing the punchline here in advance so you know what to expect when you see this example. So the upcoming example is going to illustrate the concern that CAISO raised to FERC back in 2017 that fast start pricing resulted in inappropriate price signals for flexible ramping product. And why this is the case is because when one applies ordinary fast start pricing, which ordinary again is the fast start pricing scheme that is implemented in most ISOs, that's not the alternative fast start pricing that we're talking about. It would prevent, in this case, in this example, generator 1 from being paid the opportunity cost that it incurs in the binding interval, or the cost that we just walked through of holding G1 back to 490. And so we'll see how that works out with an actual example. And again, I want to remind that these examples do not yet incorporate commitment costs into LMPs via modified offer curves for the fast start generator. So I'm using the term yet because depending on how this discussion goes today, there may be desire for folks to see price formation examples with which you would how you might consider incorporating commitment costs into LMPs under the assumption that doing something like that is desirable. Okay. Okay, so you will notice now that the gray italicized subheader in the example has changed to pricing dispatch of ordinary fast start pricing. So we're in a new calculation here relative to the example we just saw. And that new calculation, essentially, you can see it in green highlight and this red text here in the table that the fast start generator's Pmin, or its minimum output level, has been assumed away down to 0. So this is, again, even under fast start pricing, the resources would receive physical dispatch instructions from the previous calculation, and now we bring it into this pricing dispatch. This is where the prices would be relevant. Only the prices are going to be relevant here. Okay. So slide 17. Again, focus your attention on the red numbers in the slide, and I'll walk you through what to focus on here. So again, generator 1 and generator 2, in terms of their Pmax, have a combined capacity of 845 megawatts. So the fast start generator must be started in the advisory interval to meet load. So the advisory interval target is 855. G1 and G2 can't meet that by itself. So the fast start generator must be started. However, in relative to the previous example, now the fast start generator is no longer required to operate at a minimum of 35 megawatts. So you can see the energy schedule in the advisory interval is 10 and not 35. So this assumption basically says in the advisory interval that the fast start generator can operate at any level between 0 and 60. So you can also see, well, maybe I'll say this on the next slide. Yep, I'll say this on the next slide. Looking at now highlighting this $500 or 500 megawatt energy schedule in the binding interval for G1, you can see now that because the fast start generator is able to operate below its Pmin in the pricing run, that the market no longer sees the need to reposition generator 1 to be able to meet the load and uncertainty in the advisory interval. So the optimal solution would now have generator 1 operating at 500 megawatts in the binding interval. And therefore, there's no opportunity cost for generator 1 in this interval because it's operating at its full capacity and not being held back in this interval. So in slide 19, it shows generator 2 is still the marginal resource in this example because now generator 1 is fully tapped out with an energy schedule of 500 megawatts. That's the same as its Pmax. And so an incremental unit of energy in the binding interval must be obtained from generator 2. And so generator 2's energy offer of $30 sets the energy marginal price. Now let's look at flexible ramp down. So in this case, if we were going to add an additional unit of flexible ramp down in order to ascertain its marginal price, you could see that unlike the previous example that the optimization can get an additional unit of flexible ramp down without reorienting the energy schedules of any of the other units. And so the flexible ramp down marginal price in this example is 0. So here's that's the punchline, and that's sort of the basis for the CAISO's complaint to FERC that fast start pricing undermined flexible ramp signals because of this condition here, where now, because you have the ability to operate this fast start generator below its Pmin in the advisory intervals, there is it changes the opportunity cost of these resources and mutes the price signal. In this case, it's doing that for flexible ramp down. I'll sort of gloss over this, but similarly, the flexible ramp up marginal price is 0 because obtaining an incremental unit of flexi ramp up requires no changes in the energy schedule to provide it. Therefore, there's no opportunity cost. Okay, before I move on to the alternative fast start pricing example, I'll pause to see if there's any clarifying questions.
This is Mike Lynn with the Public Power Council. Thank you for these examples. I think it's pretty helpful. So when I look at this, it looks like by relaxing the P-min of the fast start resource, the optimization is seeing more downward capability on the non-fast start. So you know, does CAISO feel this is more of an issue for the price formation around flex ramp down, or do you see the issue also with flex ramp up? Because I think this maps out kind of this leads me to believe at least that it appears to be more of a flex ramp down price formation issue.
It's a good question, and without more investigation, I'm not sure I can fully answer the question, because in the FERC NOPR comments, it focused on this issue with flex ramp down, and I would imagine there's probably impacts to flex ramp up in other ways that aren't demonstrated in this example, but I'm not sure, you know, if there's a larger problem for flex ramp down relative to up, but I'd have to do some more investigation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Any questions on the phone? Okay. So now we're going to get into this same example with now consideration of the alternative fast start pricing approach, in which we're going to relax the minimum output constraint in the binding interval of the pricing dispatch, but continue to enforce the minimum output constraint during the advisory intervals of the pricing dispatch. So, you know, to steal the punchline here, you're not going to see any difference between the alternative fast start pricing approach and the status quo approach, which is a good thing. Because it's essentially saying, even though you have you're assuming away the fast start generators P-min in the binding interval, because the fast start generator is not needed in the binding interval, there's really no change in the energy schedule. So that essentially means that under the alternative fast start pricing scheme, you would not have, under this example, the same price effects to flexible ramp that you did in the previous one. So it still requires generator 1 to be operating at 490. There's still an opportunity cost associated with it. So it's a simple way of saying, you know, even under ordinary fast start pricing, just this example would have killed the FRP marginal price. But under this example, the prices in the dispatch are the same. Now, in the second example, it's intended now we're going to use the fast start generator in the binding interval. So it makes it a little more exciting. But in any way, just to reemphasize that alternative fast start pricing would not change the physical dispatch or the prices from the status quo. Okay. So now we're going to get into example 2, and we're going to have slightly different assumptions with which I'll walk through. So in example 2, generator 2 is going to have a little lower minimum and maximum output, and that's necessary for the example to work as intended. We're going to have binding interval requirement now of 830 megawatts and advisory interval requirement of 845 megawatts. So the forecasted movement between intervals is a little less steep than it was, but you're also going to have higher uncertainty requirements. So now we're going to be moving plus and minus 30 megawatts in each direction. Okay, so we'll start with the status quo, or the status quo, which is the way the CAISO market today would calculate the prices and dispatch of these units, but also represents what would be the physical dispatch calculation under fast start pricing. So focus your attention to the numbers in red, in which you'll see that the Pmax of generator 1 and 2 on the left-hand side of the table in sum is insufficient to meet both the binding interval load and the advisory interval load. So 825 megawatts of combined capacity won't help you meet 830 megawatts of energy in the binding interval. So therefore, the fast start generator is needed in the binding interval and the advisory interval. So now we'll look at the LMP in this example. Generator 2 is going to be setting the LMP in the binding interval at $30. Since generator 1, just like in the previous example, cannot increase its output any higher than 490 megawatts in the binding interval, while simultaneously being able to decrease its output to 480 megawatts in the advisory interval, which would be necessary in order to meet the downward uncertainty. So generator 2 sets the marginal price, and generator 1 again is not able to set the marginal price for energy in this case because of that constraint. Now, the flexible ramp down marginal price is the same as it was in the previous example of $10, and we'll sort of walk through why that is. If you needed an incremental unit of flexi ramp down in the binding interval, what that means is you would have to, it would necessitate a reduction in generator 1's output and an offsetting increase of generator 2's output in both the binding and advisory intervals. So generator 2 needs to be dispatched up in the binding interval schedule in order to make space for the incremental unit of flexible ramp down. And in doing so, you're trading off a $30 unit for a $25 unit, which has a $5 cost. And you do the same thing in the advisory interval, where you're increasing generator 2's schedule and decreasing generator 1's schedule, incurring a $5 cost. And the combined cost of that is $10. So the flexible ramp down would be associated with a $10 opportunity cost payment for each megawatt of the award. Now, in flexible ramp up, similar to the last requirement, if one needed an incremental unit of flexible ramp up, you can do so without changing the energy schedules of these units, because generator 2 has plenty of upward headroom and can ramp quickly. And so you don't need to reposition it relative to the earlier example to provide an incremental unit of flexible ramp up. Okay, before I move on to the ordinary fast start pricing results, I'll pause to see if there's any clarifying questions on this example.
Just a reminder for those on the phone line, please press #2 on your device if you're audio only, or press the hand raise icon below the middle of your screen. So at this time, there's no question. Oh, Harry.
Barry Servideo, GDS Associates. It's just a clarifying question here, because I got lost somewhere between switching from example 1 to example 2. With each of these, can you just reiterate on each slide what the final LMP is and what the final flexible ramping down price is, just so that's clear?
Because that's important, because that's really the basis of comparison that we're trying to make. So to reiterate, under this in example 2, under sort of the status quo example that we're in, the energy LMP is $30 set by generator 2, and the flexi ramp down marginal price is 10, because, let me go back to this slide. Because one would need to reposition generator 1 and generator 2 in the binding and advisory intervals in order to gain an extra unit of flexi ramp down in this case, because generator 1 is not able to provide incremental unit of flexi ramp down. In this case, it must come from generator 2. In order to get it from generator 2, you have to increase its energy schedule, or else it violates the constraint. And then for flexi ramp up, the marginal price is 0, and that's not going to change. So again, the important comparison points are energy LMP of $30, flexi ramp down marginal price of $10. Compared to the next example. Any other questions on the phone? Okay, so now we're in the ordinary fast start pricing world. So you can see the change in the table is represented in this green highlighted slide, where now the fast start generators PMIN is assumed down to 0 megawatts, and that is done in both the binding interval and advisory interval. So you can see in the binding interval, the fast start generator has an energy schedule of 5 megawatts, which obviously is below its physical capability of 35. It also has an advisory interval schedule below of 20 megawatts, which is below its physical characteristics of 35. So generator one and generator two have a combined capacity of 825 megawatts. So the fast start generator must be started in the binding interval to meet the load. That's the same as the previous, as the status quo. However, what's different in the fast start pricing world is that now the fast start generator is no longer required to operate at a minimum of 35, and so it receives a binding interval schedule of 5 megawatts. And so therefore its pricing dispatch is going to differ from the physical dispatch, where in the physical dispatch, it's actually receiving a schedule of 35, I believe. Let me just verify that's true. Yep, of 35, where now in the physical or in the pricing dispatch, it only has assumed to have a schedule of 5. Now, again, for price, the dispatch is only relevant for pricing purposes. This is not what the actual physical instructions these resources would get, but it is intended to show it's actually going to change the price relative to what would have been calculated under the physical dispatch. So in this case, when you have the fast start generator whose output is assumed to be able to go down all the way to 0, there's no longer the need for generator 1 to be held back for any reason, because there is shown to be plenty of downward dispatch capability accessible on the fast start generator. And so generator 1 is positioned in such a way where it's at its maximum output and therefore incurring no opportunity cost relative to the previous example where it had an energy schedule of 490, which is below its Pmax. So then in terms of calculating the energy LMP, in this case, the fast start generator is going to be the one that sets the energy LMP at $35, because if you're to need an incremental unit of energy in the binding interval schedule, generator 1 and generator 2 cannot provide more than the energy they're already scheduled for because they're running at their Pmax. So the fast start generator is the only incremental unit that can provide energy, and therefore it sets the price. That's the intended outcome of fast start pricing, is for the fast start generator in this case to be able to set the marginal price of $35 in this case, when it was unable to do so in the previous example. However, you have a flexible ramp down marginal price now of 0. So you've changed the energy LMP in these examples from 30 to 35, which is the intention of the fast start pricing. However, in doing so, you have eliminated the opportunity cost that generator 1 and generator 2 now in this case is owed for providing flexible ramp down. So the flexible ramp down marginal price has now gone from 10 megawatts to 0, because an increase in the downward uncertainty has no impact on the energy schedules in this case, as you can get incremental downward capacity from generator 2 without changing the energy schedules in this example. Similarly, the flexible ramp up marginal price remains $0 as in the previous example. Okay, so we have achieved the fast start price signal in terms of the energy price, but we have not maintained the flexi ramp up price, and therefore are no longer able to compensate those generators for their opportunity costs of providing downward capability. Okay, so before I move on to, oh wait, are we in, yeah, before I move on to how the alternative fast start pricing scheme would handle this example, I'll pause to see if there's any clarifying questions on the ordinary fast start pricing results.
Hi, James. This is Perry again. Just to clarify, so where we're at here is In the CAISO exists today, the prices were $30 and a $10 FRD price. And in the ordinary fast start pricing, the prices are $35 for energy and $0 for FRD. And all the examples up is just 0, right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. You got that right.
We do have Stephen Fruit on the queue. Let's go ahead and unmute. Stephen, please make sure to state your name and affiliation.
Thank you. Stephen Pruitt, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. I just have a question between, if you could explain a little bit more between the correlation between the physical dispatch and the pricing dispatch, because I'm looking at the binding interval here on this slide, page 35, and you're pricing or crediting the flexible ramp down of 20 megawatts to the fast start generator, but you're only scheduling it for 5. But the generator really isn't running in the binding interval. It's planned to run in the advisory interval. And that's, I guess that's the point, or I'm just trying to link the two.
Yeah. So the reason why the fast start generator in this example can provide 20 megawatts of flexible ramp down, remember that flexible ramp down comes in 2 ways. One is that it's the amount that the fast start generator can ramp down from its current status, which from the binding interval is 5 megawatts down to 0. So one might say, well, 5 megawatts seems like all the downward ramp that fast start generator can provide. However, the second component of flexible ramp down, if you look at the difference between the fast start generator in the binding interval and the advisory interval, there's a 15 megawatt upward increase in its schedule. So what that means is that you're getting that you're going from 5 to 20 of flexible ramp down because you're also able to access downward ramp capability in the advisory interval by simply not dispatching the fast start generator any higher than 5. So that's how you get to the ability for that resource to provide 20 megawatts of downward ramp with only a 5 megawatt energy schedule in the binding interval.
James, if I could jump in, it's important to recognize that in this example, which is different from example 1, FSG operates in the binding interval. You've only got 825 megawatts available at PMAX between G1 and G2, and the load in the binding interval is 830. So FSG is operating in the binding interval in this example, which is different from example 1.
Okay, those are both very helpful. So it's basically, you're basically saying just by not dispatching it, you're crediting ramp down.
That's right.
Even though it might not meet the minimum, it's still within the range of of what's being credited to the unit, and you can credit that as far as pricing.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
And I will add that there is a difference in the settlement of those 2 components that I mentioned, which we won't get into in these slides, but the portion of the portion of this fast start generator's 20 megawatt FRD award that's associated with its ability not to, or its changes in ramp from the binding interval to the advisory interval, which is a 15 megawatt quantity in this case, is settled differently than the 5 megawatt ramp down from the binding interval. And I can, if anybody's interested in learning more about the settlement, won't have time, or won't be able to do it in these slides, but feel free to reach out to me and I can help you with that. So the summary of that being that when Stephen was saying in terms applying the 20 megawatts similarly in terms of pricing, the actual settlement of that the 20 megawatts depending on its component would actually look a little bit different. There was a question in the chat I thought I saw pop up.
Yes, it's from Libby Kirby from BPA. Is there an assumption that the physical dispatch will always meet the P-min constraint, scheduling run, or it's only relaxing the constraint for purposes of pricing run?
Yeah, great question. So the assumption is that only for the pricing run in FastStart pricing are you assuming the P-min of the resource down to 0. So it's, and that's necessary because otherwise you need the physical dispatch to reflect the resource's actual physical operating characteristics, or you're going to get physical dispatch that the resource can't possibly provide. So all that FastStart pricing does is say, okay, we're going to give you the resources, the physical dispatch from the previous example, but in terms of pricing, we're going to calculate pricing based on this example where we've assumed away the minimum output constraint. And that's to enable, in this case, now what that enables is the FastStart generator is able to set the marginal price because you know, it can if you incrementally need only 5 megawatts in this example, because if you've assumed away the downward or the minimum output constraint, the FastStart generator can actually meet that. Whereas if you were to, let me go back to, sorry to switch slides on you. But if you were to enforce, now look at the binding interval energy schedule in this sense where the P-min of the resource stack constraint is honored. You can't go any lower than 5 megawatts or than 35 megawatts on the schedule. And therefore, if you need any less, the FastStart generator is not able to be the incremental unit needed to serve demand in this case. So that's what's intended.
So if I could just jump in, so just to loop back, the fundamental idea underlying fast start pricing, this is a little oversimplified, but this is the gist of it, that if you need a resource to meet load during an interval, then it should be able to set price during that interval. So that's the underlying concept. In this case, you couldn't have met load in the binding interval without running FSG. The idea is that, okay, since I needed FSG to meet load, this $35 offer should be permitted to meet load. So, and that you can see that it's needed because it gets a 5 megawatt schedule. If it wasn't needed, it would.
Yep, thanks, Mike. Any other questions on the phone or in the room before we move on? Okay. Okay, so we'll summarize again. So in example 2, under the status quo, we had an energy price of $30. We had a flexi ramp down marginal price of 10. When you apply traditional fast start or ordinary fast start pricing, as we're calling it, you enable the fast start generator's $35 offer to set the price, but you have eliminated the opportunity cost of dispatching generator 1 below its full capacity, and have eliminated the flexi ramp down price signal to $0. So now let's look at how the same example would work under the concept of alternative fast start pricing, in which we relax the minimum output constraint in the binding interval, but we maintain the minimum output constraint in the advisory interval. So here you'll see the change in the fast start generator's energy schedule in the binding interval and the advisory interval. So first notice that the binding interval schedule for fast start generator, highlighted in red, is 15, which is below its physical operating level, below its minimum physical operating level of 35, because it's not enforced in the binding interval. But you'll see in the advisory interval, it is enforced. So in the advisory interval, the fast start generator cannot take on a schedule less than 35. So what this does is you still have, so generator 1 and generator 2 are positioned. You notice their energy schedules of 490 and 325 look similar to the physical dispatch, where generator 1 is being withheld from providing its full capacity because it's needed to meet the flexible ramp down requirement. So in this case, when we're looking at the energy LMP on slide 37, the fast start generator is able to set the LMP in the binding interval of $35. And that's because that's for 2 reasons. One is that generator 1, as in previous examples, can't move higher than 490 megawatts in the binding interval and simultaneously be able to meet the downward uncertainty. Generator 2 cannot meet an incremental unit of energy because it's scheduled at 325, which is its maximum output. So it's all tapped out. So the fast start generator is the only generator left with which you can get incremental energy, and therefore it sets the price of $35. This is the intended outcome of fast start pricing. So we have maintained the fast start pricing energy price signal. Now let's look at what happens with flexible ramp down. Sorry for the small text, but there was more to be discussed here. But flexible ramp down in this case would now have a marginal price of $15, not 10, as it was in the original example. However, let's sort of break down why that might be. So in the first example, you had essentially, if you needed additional downward uncertainty, it required the redispatch of generator 1 and generator 2 in the binding and advisory intervals, which within each interval incurred a $5 cost. Now the fast start generator is the marginal generator in the binding interval. And so the opportunity cost in the binding interval alone is actually $10, which represents the difference between generator 1 and the fast start generator's offer, 35 compared to 25. And then in the advisory interval, you have a similar trade-off where now you need to increase or generator 1, you have to decrease generator 1's output by 1 megawatt in the advisory interval, increase generator 2 by 1 megawatt, and that's a $5 trade-off. So in sum, you have a $15 opportunity cost here. So actually relative to the current example, the flexi ramp down prices actually increase relative to the $10 example. And we'll talk about a little bit on the upcoming slides about why that is. But essentially now that by nature of the fast start generator setting the energy LMP, it actually increases the opportunity cost in this interval because now instead of a $30 price, you have a $35 price, with which you have to compensate generator 1 for. And similar to the other examples, the flexi ramp up marginal price is 0, and I won't get much into that, but it doesn't change. Okay, before I move on to some discussion points, some more general discussion points, let's go back and see if there's any questions in the chat or the phone or in the room on the last example.
We do have a question from chat first. Lindsay, NV Energy asked if the fast start generator does not receive a physical dispatch to PMIN, then does it receive any revenue from being selected in the pricing run?
Can you say it one more time?
If the fast start generator does not receive a physical dispatch to PMIN, then does it receive any revenue from being selected in the pricing run?
Got it. Yeah, the answer is no. So the physical dispatch of the fast start generator is 0. Let me go back. So again, remember that the pricing dispatch is only relevant for pricing purposes. And for physical dispatch, you would, actually, I'm sorry, wait a minute. So, no, I'm sorry. So in this example, the physical dispatch of so okay, let me back up. The answer is yes, because what's different in this example from the previous example is that the fast start generator is actually needed in this example to meet load in the binding interval. Therefore, it has a physical schedule of 35 megawatts. So its compensation would be 35 megawatts times $35 price. That would be its total energy compensation in this example.
Okay, and then we have one hand raised from Stephen from LA Department of Water and Power. Let's go ahead.
So, sorry if I missed something earlier. This is really my first pricing formation workshop ever, so my brain is overheating, but it's very, very interesting. Why is it that in the flexible ramp down column, why is it that we're applying the 20 in the generator 1 row and not in the FSG row? Because physically the G1 can't give you 20, it can only give you 10, right? But we're keeping the 20 in there.
Is this slide a good point? Is this slide relevant to your question? Or do I need to move to a different slide?
Yeah, no, I think it's relevant to a lot of them. So if you look at the generator one row and the flexible ramp down column, and you have 20 attributed to generator one, but it's not capable of doing 20. And what you're doing is you're using the fast start generator, but you're not giving it the credit. It would be like 10, 10, and 10, wouldn't it? To make 30 rather than 20, 10, 0.
It is challenging to do these on the fly, so we'll do our best to walk through. I don't know, Mike, do you have any initial thoughts?
Yeah, let me tell you the way I think about it. Because yeah, I see these tables and they kind of warp my brain a little bit too. So the FRD and the FRD and the FRU are relative to the energy schedule and the advisory interval. Okay, so yeah, it's tempting because you see them listed under binding interval to go ahead and want to subtract them or add them from the energy schedule that's in between FRD and FRU, but that's actually not right. So which, in this case, for example, in order to get down to 815 megawatts, what are you going to do? Well, you can go ahead and in the advisory interval, get down to 815 in the advisory interval. What are you going to do? Well, FSG has to run at 35. It can't run any lower than 35. You've committed it because you think you might need it. So it's running at 35 and it can't do any less. You can reduce G2 from 310 to 300, but it can't go any lower than that because that's its Pmin. So that's 10 megawatts of FRD that it's providing, but I need to get down by 30 megawatts. I need to come up with a dispatch that would actually meet 815 megawatts in the advisory interval. If I'm at 35 in the advisory interval on FSG, 300 on G2, I need to be at 480 on G1. 480 plus 300 is 780, plus 35 is 815. So the other 20 megawatts of reduction would come from G1. So G1 would be doing, in the event that we had 815 megawatts of load in the advisory interval, it would be going down from 500 to 480. So the way I think about it is essentially I take the energy schedule in the advisory interval minus the FRD, and that essentially gives me a dispatch that would meet the forecasted level of load in the advisory interval minus the downward uncertainty. And then you can do something parallel for the upward uncertainty, which is very boring in this example. But
I appreciate that. I think I see exactly what you're talking about. So you're looking at the advisory interval, and you're saying, well, I get 20 because rather than dispatching generator one up to 500 as I was planning, I'm going to decrement it down 10, so I get 20 total in the advisory interval as a result. And that's where I can credit the 20 from.
right, you need to be able to get to 480. G1 needs to be able to preserve the ability to get to 480 because it has to move down to 480 in order to meet 815 megawatts of load, which is the low load scenario in the advisory interval. And that's why it can't go above 490 in the present binding interval because it ramps so slowly. It only goes at 10 megawatts per minute. To preserve the ability to go to 480 in the advisory, it can't go above 490 in the binding.
I see. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Stephen. Any other? Okay. So let's move on to some general discussion points. So again, the punchline here is intended to be that there may be possibilities of implementing something in the ISO's market with which fast start pricing can be applied, and you get the price signal intended from fast start pricing in the energy price, while at the same time maintaining the price signal of flexi ramp up and down. So let's talk about a couple of discussion points and reactions from the actual mechanism with which we do this. So I wanted to bring up this point about that in the status quo example, the flexi ramp down opportunity cost was only $10, where in the alternative fast start pricing scheme, it would actually increase the price of flexible ramp down to 15. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the compensation therefore is inappropriate or the price signal is wrong. It actually is still the correct price signal by nature of the fact that opportunity cost by definition is the difference between the resources offer and the the price with the energy price. And so in a sense, by increasing the energy price via the fast start pricing scheme, you have also increased opportunity costs for any resource that would, has an offer. In this case, generator one had an offer of $25, and the energy price it's seeing is $35. So you must compensate it at least $10 per megawatt in order for it not to chase the price in that example, or to violate be incentivized to violate its dispatch instructions. But it's not necessarily inappropriate price if one agrees with the principles of fast start pricing generally. Then one may also agree that FRP compensation is fair in this case. The second thing I'll mention before I pause is that in terms of looking forward to potential implementation of something like this, one thing to note is that in this example, the fast start generator had a really fast ramp rate. And so by assuming the resource down to 0 and then keeping let me actually back up a slide to show my point. So this resource has a ramp rate of 15 megawatts per minute, which is 75 megawatts in an interval, which means that it can ramp between its maximum and minimum in one interval, right? So there's really no ramp constraint for this resource. However, if one were to consider that the ramp rate of the fast start generator, let's say, was something like 1, in which it would restrict the movement between intervals to 5 megawatts, 1 megawatt a minute times 5 minutes. That means that if you were to apply this constraint in the advisory interval to say that the fast start generator can go no lower than 35, that means the binding interval schedule would be limited to 30 because it's ramp constrained. So the idea here being that the relaxation of the minimum output constraint in the advisory interval may be limited by the resource's ramp constraint, and it would likely be necessary to relax the ramping constraint of the fast start generator on portions below its Pmin, which makes sense anyway because physically speaking, the resource between 0 and 35 in this case doesn't really have a ramp rate. This is a fictional part of its dispatch capability. So therefore, we wouldn't want to artificially, add in a ramp rate that's not actually a part of the characteristics of the resource. And the consequence of that could be, without this sort of idea, is that, well, if this fast start generator only had a ramp rate of 1 megawatt per minute, then its ability to set price would be constrained by the ramp rate itself, because it could go no lower than 30 megawatts in the binding interval schedule. Mike, did you want to add on anything to that?
No, I think that makes the point. If you basically, what can happen is that if we enforce the ramp rate limitation on the fast start unit, then what can happen is we're enforcing also the minimum output level of the Pmin in the advisory interval. And what happens, it comes through the back door. But if we enforce Pmin in the advisory interval, then we're effectively also enforcing a minimum output in the binding interval, because if you can't go below Pmin in the advisory, then you can't go below Pmin minus 5 times your ramp rate in the binding interval. And so that's inconsistent with the general principle underlying fast start pricing, which is that in the binding interval, you'd like to let the unit go down to 0. If you let it go down to 0, then if you have a where if you need just 1 megawatt from that unit, it can set the price. If you set it the minimum at some level that's above 0, if you set it at 5 or 10 or 20, whatever it happens to be, then if you needed less than 5 or 10 or 20, wherever you set it, it wouldn't be able to set the price at that. So you would be preventing the unit from setting price in the binding interval, even when it was needed to be loaded in that interval. So I think that's why it's going to be necessary not to enforce that ramp constraint between the advising and binary intervals. But let me emphasize, that's just for the fast start unit. We would still, enforce ramp constraints for the non-fast start units, for G1 and G2 in this example. Those can be important.
Thanks, Mike. Any questions on this slide here?
We do have Joshua Arnold from PG&E up next for Q question. Let's go ahead.
Good afternoon, Josh Arnold, PhD. I've been looking at the numbers on slide 39, and just something doesn't make conceptual sense to me, James. So I'm looking at the binding interval on the FSG, on the fast start generator. You take 15 megawatts of energy, add 16 megawatts of FRU. You've only got 31 megawatts on that unit in the binding interval. Its P-min is 35. So that 31 is in a non-dispatchable region. So I'm concerned that in this example, you're assigning a dispatchability to an area that can't respond. I mean, you could stop the startup of the generator if it's fast enough to respond that quickly, or you got to get it to 35 before you can do anything with it. So where's you getting that 31 from when it's under the 35 megawatt P-min?
Yeah, so the 16 megawatts of flexi ramp up in this case is actually relative to the resources advisory interval energy schedule, in which case the assumption is that you're essentially saying I can move from 15 in the binding interval to anywhere between 35 and 51 megawatts in the advisory interval. So that's where the 16 comes from, because it's relative to the advisory interval quantity.
Well, I guess the other question is, where does that 15 come in from on the energy side? Again, it's not dispatchable. It's in startup. It could be at 0, it could be at 15, it could be at 35. Units don't ramp on a linear curve. We know this.
So the
I'm just wondering where the 15 comes from.
Yeah, so one point of clarification that might have been helpful for this slide is that, so in the green text here, or the green highlighted text, we have a P-min of 35, which is only being applied in the advisory interval and not being applied in the binding interval. So you can get 15 megawatts out of this unit because in the binding interval, we've assumed away the minimum output constraint. So it can set, it can operate anywhere between 0 and 35 in the binding interval.
But when physical reality hits the wall, you have no guarantee you're going to get 15 out of it.
Okay.
And we've been talking about, especially with relation to flexible ramping and other products, deliverability is key. And this is one of the reasons I've never liked, I'll be honest, I don't like fast start pricing for this exact reason. It divorces the actual unit characteristics and capabilities from the dispatch of the pricing signal. Because until that unit gets to 35, you don't know where it is. And I don't think you can assume that 15 is actually even feasible in the binding interval. You can't assume anything until you get your advisory at 35.
It's important to recognize that this is only determining prices. It's not determining physical schedules. The unit is getting a 35 megawatt generation instruction in this interval because it's needed to meet load in this interval. What we haven't taken into account in this example is any sort of ramp rate, ramping in of the unit. We've said that the unit needs to run to meet load in the binding interval because there's not enough generating capacity between G1 and G2 to meet load in the binding interval or in the advisory interval, in example 2. So it is actually running at 35 megawatts, both the binding and advisory intervals. So what we're doing with the ordinary, the alternative FSP is only determining prices, essentially only determining was that unit or was some portion of that unit needed to meet load in those intervals. If so, and it was in both those intervals, it would be used to set price. And then also determining the prices of the FRD and FRU prices consistent with that.
Okay, but in this binding interval, that's a fictitious number. So you can't assume it's being used to meet load until it gets to 35. You don't know where it is on the curve. An assumption is not a physical reality. Load is a physical reality. Now, if you want to give that unit 51, I would say if you want to give that unit 51 megawatts of FRU, that makes sense because after dispatch to 35, it can get all the way to 51. It can give you a lot of FRU. I just don't see where the energy is coming in when it's a nebulous region on a startup curve.
There is no assumption being made here that the unit is in some undetermined point during its ramp up region. It is at 35. That is its physical dispatch instruction. We are assuming it is operating inconsistently with that dispatch instruction. The 15 here is simply being used to assess whether a part of that unit is needed to meet load, which it is.
Yeah, and if I may,
35 is for the advisory interval, not the binding interval, right? Am I misunderstanding that?
Part of the, the unit runs at least at 35 in binding and the advisory intervals in this example, not in example one. In the example one, it only ran in the advisory interval. But in example two, there are only 825 megawatts at Pmax between G1 and G2, 830 megawatts of load. So the unit needs to be running. And as I said, we're not in this example going through assumptions as to exactly what the ramp in schedule is going to be. We're assuming that it is running at 35 megawatt Pmin in both the binding and the advisory.
yeah, so if I may jump in, I mean, one clarifying point is that, and that may be confusing, is that in this example, these dispatch numbers are irrelevant. These are not these are only relevant for pricing purposes. So if one is to look wanting to find the actual physical instructions given to the resources, this is where you would find it in the physical dispatch here. So that's why that 15 megawatts is a fictitious number in the sense that that's not its actual physical dispatch or physical award. It's 35 here. So the dispatch numbers here are what would actually be instructed to the units.
Okay, so on this one, that makes sense. But now you have a total of energy and FRU of 50, not 51. So it looks like on the other example, you've credited them an extra unit of flexibility that doesn't exist in the physical model.
But again, it's not it's only for pricing purposes. It's not
But
actually
megawatts matter to prices.
it's
We
not
know this.
actually, but it's not actually giving them an additional unit of flexi ramp. And these are not even, so this is a thought experiment. You know,
Yeah.
if you needed an additional unit, where might you get it from? In this case,
Okay.
in this case, you'd get it from generator 2. So if physically you actually did have a 31 megawatt requirement, you would get it from generator 2. And it wouldn't change the pricing because in both cases there's no opportunity cost for flexi ramp up in this case. I hope that helps. There's a question in the room.
Hey, James, Perry Servideo, GDS Associates. I didn't want to really take us deep diving into the numbers here, but I did have a question I think relates to the talking point that you queued up, and that's where the assumption of the ramp rate of the fast start generator is once it's below its Pmin, and how you pick 15 megawatts per minute for that resource.
So let me go back to this slide. I'm going to be on slide 39 here. So just to tee up, and you might have follow-up comments to this, but essentially what we're saying is that a nicety of this example is that the fast start generator's ramp rate is so high that 15 megawatts per minute is 75 megawatts in an interval. So it can move between Pmin and Pmax in one interval. So there's really no ramp restriction in this example. And what I was saying is that, well, if you were to imagine the ramp on the actual physical ramp of that resource to be a lot slower, let's say 1 megawatt per minute, then, and you were to apply in the advisory interval this constraint where it can't be any less than 35 megawatts in the advisory interval, what that necessarily means is that if you are to apply ramp rates between the binding interval and the advisory interval, the ramp rate would restrict the binding interval to be no lower than 30 megawatts because it can't ramp any faster than that. So it essentially removes or sort of undermines the point of assuming that resource can move down to 0. So in essence, the ramp rate of the resource is based on its ramp characteristics in its actual operating range. So we think it's fine to essentially assume, as is stated on slide 40, that you would, in the second bullet, first sub-bullet, you would relax the ramping constraint of the fast start generator between the binding and advisory intervals on portions below its P-min. Because essentially any portion below its P-min doesn't really have a actual ramp rate. It has a startup time and things like that would be enforced, but
When you say relax, you mean just completely relax, assume it can reach its P-min within the 5 minutes?
if it's start upable in 5 minutes, yeah. So essentially you would apply startup times as the speed with which you can get to your P-min and not apply any sort of ramp constraint on portions below the P-min.
Yeah, so that was,
Can I clarify which of the 15 megawatts you were asking about? Because there were about 3 of them on that slide.
yeah, the assumed ramp rate for the fast start generator in the blue column,
okay.
the ramp. I'm just,
Okay,
it's
all right.
next to me, we haven't walked through why we can assume it's 15 megawatts per minute once it's below its P-min in that range, and what the CAISO might be thinking on setting that ramp rate, because it impacts
Right.
the calculation.
Let me try another way of putting it in. So we would apply the 15 megawatt per minute ramp rate on the actual dispatchable range. So wish I had a whiteboard up here, but between 35 and 60, you would apply the 15-minute ramp rate, but between 0 and 35, you would not, essentially.
Yeah, I think.
Wait, sorry, you can't see him, but Perry's about to respond. He's trying to click.
So then
I need a third camera.
Assuming that the movement below P-min will be whatever, based on startup time. I'm just saying, what's the methodology there for how fast it can move when it's below its P-min?
So, yeah,
there was like a missing assumption at the very beginning, I think. That I missed.
So again, the physical dispatch. Let's go back to here. So this 35 megawatts in the binding interval is its actual physical dispatch instruction, and that's going to be governed by its startup time. If you're assuming, like, let's say in interval minus -1, that you started this interval and now they're available in the binding interval, that means that resource had a startup time of 5 minutes or less, right? So that would still govern the physical characteristics of this. Now, only under the assumption of reducing in the sort of the alternative fast start pricing assumption of reducing in the pricing dispatch the unit down to 0, will you relax the ramp, only because, like we're saying, it's not, the ramp rate below P-min is not real. So you wouldn't want a ramp rate restriction to sort of artificially depress your ability to get this fast start generator assumed down to 0, or else it will have limited ability to set the price.
Right. But it would, you're saying artificially, could it have the impact of artificially making the pricing run think that there's more or less FRU available, or more or less FRD available than actually available, depending on how you set that?
So let me go back to slide 40. So we've been playing around with some examples, and so far we haven't identified any issues like that, but that's not to say that doesn't exist. It's just in what we've been able to identify so far, that hasn't happened. Mike, do you want to elaborate at all on that, or is that okay?
No, I think that's good. I just, we've, as I understood the question, the question was, so we're going to relax the 15 megawatt ramp rate between 0 and 35. What about above that? And I would say that in my investigations, it frankly doesn't matter whether you enforce it or not in the 35 to 60 megawatt range. I mean, it just doesn't make any difference.
Another question in the room?
You hear? Yeah, so I think if I can go back to a very high level assumptions in this example, is the idea that the fast start unit can only come online in the advisory interval. That's why we are assuming it's not online in binding, but in advisory.
So the reason why we're assuming, so the intention is to try to essentially eliminate the market, the optimization from seeing additional ramp than is actually physically present. So that's where the assumption of holding it, the minimum output in the advisory interval comes from, is it's an attempt to sort of prevent in the ordinary fast start pricing where the market sees a whole bunch of downward dispatch capability because it can operate the unit anywhere between 0 and 35 in the advisory intervals. And so there's no opportunity cost for ramp because the market thinks it can get it from this fast start resource. But by restricting it in the advisory interval, you've sort of taken away the ability for that resource to provide, in this case, downward ramp that's not actually present, because any ramp that it actually does provide in the advisory intervals would have to maintain its actual ability to provide the ramp. Does that make sense?
No, I still miss the whole point that why in the examples we are only considering it showing up in advisory, not in the binding. Is it just to get the impact of its offers in the binding interval?
Oh, so let me go back here. So in this example, the fast start generator, well, let me go back way farther. So here's the physical dispatch solution here. So in this example too, the fast start generator is actually needed in the binding interval and the advisory interval. But what you're and in example 1, it's not needed in the binding interval, but it is needed in the advisory interval. So assuming like it started up in the binding interval and then it's operating in the advisory interval. But are you wanting to see an example with something separate?
Not from example, but from principal point of view, right? Like what we are trying to address here is to get the impact of fast start unit shows up in advisory, not in the binding, and get the impact of that offers in the binding. Is that the whole point of at how the fast start pricing would work?
So
Because
I think, yeah.
we are relaxing only some constraints and not all constraints, right? We are really relaxing P-min constraint for the fast start in the binding when it's showing up in it. We are not relaxing, say, ramp constraint of G1 or G. Some inherent assumptions for the fast start pricing.
Right.
So
yeah.
What is the constraint we are relaxing? We are only relaxing the P-min and the ramp constraint for fast start
In the binding interval.
in the binding interval. So
Yeah.
if the resource, say, came online in the third advisory, second advisory, would the example still scale the same way?
So you would, so I think another way of answer or thinking about your question may be that the fast start pricing signal only will show up in the binding interval, not in the advisory intervals because of this. So that, like, let's say, let's take us like 2 intervals in the past, right? And you were to have this exact same situation, because these same constraints aren't being handled, you wouldn't have an advisory interval price for this interval, which is now the binding interval, of $35 because you don't have the same assumptions. So I think that might be what you're, not quite, okay.
I don't want to derail the whole conversation because it's to simplify and principles. The whole idea is scale it to all. A unit can have, you could get into scenarios where everything is binding. It's contingent on unit coming online, third advisory, and everything else is linked.
Yeah, so I think my impression, as and this will need more work, obviously, but my impression is that this would only be necessary for the first binding interval, because the flexible ramp price, as it is today, is incorporating prices in the binding in the first advisory interval, and opportunity costs that persist in intervals longer than that don't get captured in the FRP price. And so it may be the case, and actually this is something that we're thinking about exploring in price formation generally is whether or not to apply longer horizons for the FRP price, such that you can capture within the FRP price more opportunity costs than you can today, where it would be limited just to opportunity costs seen in the binding and first advisory intervals.
Thank you.
Yep. I have another question in the room, just so you know.
Perry Servideo again. This is just to make sure I'm clear. So the physical dispatch is status quo. That's what KISO does today.
Yep.
Ordinary fast start pricing would apply this this relaxation in all intervals, binding and advisory.
Yep.
And then this alternative fast start pricing only applies the relaxation to the binding interval.
Yep.
Do I get that? Did I get that right?
Yep.
See, do you find it odd that in order to get the right prices that send the right incentives, that you have to actually not use fast start pricing in the advisory interval? It seems kind of backwards that if we're saying, hey, we need to use fast start pricing to get right prices, but actually in order to get the right prices, it's the solution is to not use it in the binding. To me, it just seems like at a high level, it should be the same in all if it's the right way to go.
Yeah, and I guess it's an important question, and I don't think we can talk about this for a while, but I think that one of the benefits is that you will have advisory interval pricing. Well, I guess what I'm seeing in your question is that maybe there's a conflict in the sense that you have a multi-interval optimization that's setting up resources based on advisory interval prices that are themselves based on status quo pricing. And then only and so you're not using fast start pricing principles in the advisory intervals to set up your resources. And maybe there's a conflict there. Is that essentially what you're saying? And Perry says yes, out of the microphone. Yeah, it's an interesting thought, and I don't know I have more to say than that, other than I understand what you're saying.
I mean, I guess if I could just jump in, I think, going back again to what I said, kind of the fundamental idea underlying fast start pricing is essentially, do we need the generator to meet load in the binding interval? And in order to do that, we may need it, but we may need it at less than its P-min. We only need a portion of its P-min. So to the extent that we enforce the P-min, we will find that it's not on the margin, and that will give us our current, pricing construct. It won't be able to set the LFP. So that's the whole purpose of relaxing into zero during the binding interval, is to essentially permit it, if any portion of it is needed to meet load in the binding interval, to permit it to be on the margin and set the LMP. I think it's probably the minimal. So that's the minimal thing you need to do in order to essentially permit fast start pricing to work. And I think that's what we're doing. We're doing the minimal thing you need to do to get fast start pricing to work, while at the same time, we don't need to relax, P-min in the other for the fast start unit in the other advisory interval, or multiple advisory intervals if we're looking on the road, in order to make fast start pricing work, and so we're not. Because we don't, it lets us go ahead and reflect some of the constraints, such as what happens when I have 35 megawatts coming in from FSG in the advisory interval, and the other resources need to dispatch themselves around that. So I see it as we're essentially doing the minimum necessary, the minimum number of changes necessary to the physical dispatch in order to permit fast start pricing to work, and nothing more.
So that answer makes me a little bit uncomfortable. I thought what I had heard you say earlier is that the fundamental concept of fast start pricing is to show that if the resources needed to flow, then it should be eligible to set price. There was not at least earlier when you spoke, there was not a distinction between binding and advisory. And kind of to Josh's point is this is, why are we running this multi-interval optimization today is to set resources up to have a reliable dispatch.
Right.
So in my head, I would think, okay, if fast start pricing is the right way to go, then why would it why does it not apply to the advisory interval prices as well?
Oh,
And in this particular example, in the first advisory interval price for setting the prices.
Yeah, and you know, sort of piggyback on that, you know, when we were going back to so the whole objective of essentially what you're seeing on the screen in these examples is to try to find a way to provide fast start pricing signals while also maintaining flexible ramping product price signals. And it may be that the only way to do that is that you can see the fast start pricing signal only in the binding interval and not in any other intervals. And that just might be the limitation based on, you know, our market and as it functions. There may be ways to solve that, but were there any other questions on the phone? Okay.
Michelle, we can go ahead and unmute Alva.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, James. These two examples are sort of constructed in a way that leads me to think it's really and I sympathize with the way Michael phrased the objectives, and I think that that's a reasonable objective, although I'm not sure if I see it as absolutely essential. But this is not fast start pricing. The start is irrelevant here. And I think that was part of the confusion is you have two examples, one where the resource is at 0 and then it goes to 35, and the other where you have it at 35 and the minimum's 35. And I was looking back at the first example, and start is irrelevant in that example. So you've wished the problem away there. And then in this problem, you're just looking at how to, essentially develop a way to price the capabilities of the unit in the next interval in a plausible way. And to me, this example makes sense. Example 2 makes sense as a way you might, sort of jigger the prices to get something that is reasonable. But in terms of how the actual market works, I think two comments. One is that Perry's idea would lead to an infinite regress where you're trying to figure out what's going to happen in interval interval +2 in order to get the prices in interval +1. So I don't think that concept is very workable. But looking back from where we actually are in the way the market works, if you have a resource that actually has to be started up, then I think your earlier point is valid, which is there's no resource that can be given a startup instruction, or the number is vanishingly small in the KAISO market, can be given a startup instruction for the next interval and can be setting prices for the can be providing flexible ramping and setting prices in the next interval. There's going to be a startup time that is going to make that construct not workable. And if you were trying to provide those examples, they'd be 10 times more complicated than the ones you're showing here, I think, because then you have to include the possibility that you're going to either make a startup instruction or retract it. So I'm not sure that I see this as having anything to do with fast start pricing, and I wish the word weren't really even included in the, at least in terms of the examples you've provided so far.
Thanks, Alba. Yeah, those are good comments, and I think there may be more to explore in terms of this idea that, are we in this example, we're restricting the number of look aheads to the ones that are relevant for the example and the application here, but could there be unintended consequences potentially where you have an RTD that runs 10 future intervals and you're making dispatch decisions that are positioning resources in order to meet load in some future intervals, and if you have if you don't have those fast start pricing signals sort of baked into the entire look ahead, might there be issues? So
right,
it's interesting.
and do you need to pay for the flexibility that you're now going to be counterbalancing against this new adjustment to the energy price. You know, that's the other thing is, like you said, you have to actually construct 10 flexible ramping products to uh, essentially compensate resources that are being adjusted because of that.
Yeah, and something that's also sort of missing. So this is an RTD example. I mean, one would the expectation would be that we would apply something similar in the 15-minute market. Now,
Right.
it might not look exactly the same because you know, there's a concept of buffer interval in the 15-minute market, and you know, the way that flexible ramping product and energy is purchased in the FMM is a little different than RTD because of that. But you know, if you know, in the concept of, well, there may not be sufficient 5-minute startupable resources to make this worthwhile. If you expand that to 15-minute in the FMM, that might be a little better. So, you know, this is consuming within the RTD just to make the examples a little easier to follow. But, you know, one would expect that we would apply these concepts, maybe not exactly as they are here, but something similar in the FMM as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Alba.
Do have a question from Libby Kirby, BPA. You're next.
Hi there, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great, thanks. This is Libby Kirby from BPA. Thanks, already announcing it. I think you might have tried to address this already and I just wasn't caught up yet, but looking at the difference between like slide 32 and 36, I get that we're doing this, like the LMP is going to be $35 regardless of which style fast start pricing. I get that we're trying to address the FRU, FRD price, I think at least, but I'm still slightly lost on how we end up with the energy schedule of 15. I recognize that that's not the actual energy award, but why do we end up at 15 if the ramp is so large? Like at 15 megawatts per minute, you've got lots of room there. Is it to do with G1, that difference between that 490 and that 500, or am I just missing how the ramp is then applied on?
No, your intuition's good. So let's walk through it. So let's focus. So this is slide 36, and I'm going to focus in on the binding interval energy schedule and sort of walk through each. So in this example, neither generator 1 nor generator 2 can provide incremental energy in the binding interval without violating some sort of constraint. Now, generator 1 is limited to 490. It can't go any higher than that, because if it were to go any higher than that, it would not be able to dispatch or be prepared to dispatch down to meet the downward uncertainty that's needed. So Libby, imagine that generator 1 was at 491 in this case.
Mm-hmm. It can't get to 480 from there.
It can't get to, exactly. It can't get to 480, so it's constrained.
Is there a reason? Is there a reason that in the ordinary FSP we put the energy schedule at 500? Is that unit also not having its ramp rate whatever taken into account in that piece?
So the difference here, look at the, so I'm back on slide 32, which is the ordinary example. Mm-hmm. Look at the flexible ramp down awards here. So in this case, you've got.
Got you, the FRD got moved.
Yeah, you know why, and why? Okay. Because in this case, for the fast start generator, because in the advisory interval, the fast start generator can operate freely between 0 and 35. The market sees the fast start generator as being able to provide flex ramp down in this case. Switch to slide 36. And in this case, the fast start generator can't provide any flex ramp down because it's constrained in the advisory interval. It can't go any.
To 30. Okay. I'm following. So then the 20 has to stay on G1, and then because of that, the 15 is literally just to make the energy schedule come out whole.
You got it. Yep.
Okay, I'm following. Okay, thank you. That's all I needed.
Thank you.
We do have Jeff Spires. Let's go ahead and unmute. Please make sure to state your affiliation.
Hi, James. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. Thanks for putting together these examples. I think they've been very helpful. And that it also sounds like you've been experimenting with some other examples as well. And one question that I think I know the answer to, but I just wanted to get your reaction to is, in the various examples you've experimented with, have you seen any difference in the energy price in the binding interval between the two different approaches, between ordinary fast start pricing and alternative fast start pricing, or is the energy price in the binding interval the same all the time?
As far as I know, in the examples we've experimented with, the alternative fast start pricing mechanism maintains the ordinary fast start pricing energy price. Is that your, is that, let me just ask Mike if that's also his experience.
Give me a sec. Yeah, we do have some examples actually where we get, no, I'm looking at something different. Yeah, we actually do have some examples where we get different prices, I think, between the ordinary and the alternative fast start pricing. And I think in those cases, the alternative fast start pricing actually gives more appropriate results.
So it may be, Jeff, that in those that it might be that those type of examples may be of interest to walk through.
Yeah, well, and definitely, I think it would be interesting to try to understand where those differences might arise. And one thought might be, I think you had some discussion earlier today about doing some data analysis, but using real world data potentially for some period, for a day or a handful of days, and trying to calculate what the prices would have looked like both under the status quo and then the two different fast start concepts, to be able to sort of say, here's what it would look like with real world dispatches. I don't know how complicated that would be, but using the assumption that this is really about the price formation and that the dispatch would be the same, it seems like you could probably use some historical dispatch information to take a look at what the different approaches might produce with that real world information.
Yeah, and so since I'm not on the analysis team, I won't overpromise anything here. But my understanding is that the CAISO team is preparing for analyses like you mentioned, where it may be possible to take a sample day and simulate under different scenarios, what prices might have looked like, and sort of discuss, how, the appropriateness of the certain price signals you're seeing. So I think that's within our capability and something we think would be important to walk through.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
We can go to the phone line for the question, Michelle.
Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi,
Sorry,
this is
I just
Callie Wells
needed-
with WPTF. Oh, did they unmute you, Michelle, as well?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Are you sure?
Yep. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. This is Callie Wells with WPTF. So I wasn't quite sure where to raise this, but I think you did mention, or at least hit on some potential unintended consequences. And one thing that I've been thinking through is, if I'm understanding this right, you're going to be enforcing the minimum load constraint in the advisory intervals. But when that advisory interval becomes the binding interval, you're going to relax that constraint for pricing purposes. So if I have that right, you could see some differences between the energy price that comes out of one interval when it's the advisory versus the energy price that comes out of that interval when it's the binding, even if everything else stays the same. And I wonder what that's going to do to the dispatch of storage resources, right? That's a topic I think that's within this initiative as well, is looking at the impact the advisory prices has on storage resources, especially when they don't materialize when it becomes binding. So this this alternative proposal, I appreciate you guys giving some thought to it and trying to address the FRP pricing. But in doing so, I'm wondering if an unintended consequence is now potentially inefficient dispatch of storage resources. Have you guys thought through that at all?
So it's on our radar, and some comments from this discussion are leading us into thinking that it's an idea worth exploring more. But yeah, and I know that we're aware of the sort of history behind complaints about the advisory interval prices as it relates to storage resources, and whether or not this may exacerbate those issues or not is something we need to investigate. But I could only speculate as to what that would be. So let's just say we'll put it on our radar to investigate more.
Okay, I appreciate that. But do I have that right, though, that whenever, under this alternative proposal, whenever you do have a fast start resource that's impacting the pricing, you will have different prices in advisory and a binding interval?
Presumably, yes. All else equal.
Yeah, right. All else equal. Okay. All right. Yeah, if you guys can give that some more thought, and we will as well, because I think it is, potentially an unintended consequence that under this alternative proposal that we need to talk about.
Okay. Thanks, Callie.
We could go ahead and unmute Michelle.
So this is Michelle from the CPUC, and I'm having a little trouble just distilling this down. So what is the takeaway that you think that this is something that you want to move forward with and look into further? Is that what I'm hearing? Is that the sort of bottom line?
I think there's more needed to firmly answer that question, and part of that would be in terms of empirical analysis that still needs to justify the presence of fast start pricing beyond just these examples are intended for more so educational for people to get the sense for how pricing might work under different schemes, but I think that the ISO feels that there's still more work to be done in terms of justifying whether or not fast start pricing becomes something that shows up in a formal proposal and would need to be informed by empirical analysis.
Okay, and so a couple of questions about that. So what is your thinking about the timing of this initiative? Like, should you move forward? What year are you thinking about? Just so I can understand this. And then I have a couple more questions.
When you say what year, are you talking about implementation?
Yeah.
So I believe that the current implementation schedule of this initiative for the first phase would occur 1 year after the DAME and EDAM implementation.
Okay.
So
2026?
does that make it either fall of 2025, maybe with the go live of spring 2026?
Okay.
Something
And can
like
you
that.
just remind me what the overall purpose of this is? Like, just simply, I guess I lose it when we're talking about all these numbers. What are we trying to incent here?
I think in terms of the purpose is, the purpose generally is to explore whether or not fast start pricing can coexist within our market. And part of these discussions will, there's sort of two sides of the coin here in terms of that. One is sort of these, I'd call them more so principled style debates about whether or not, fast start pricing principles aligns with the ISO's price formation principles generally, which is, I'd say more of a philosophical discussion. But then the other side of the coin is, okay, well, even if you agree maybe in principle that fast start pricing should be included within the ISO's market structure, are you expecting to gain anything in terms of market efficiency or operational efficiency that you wouldn't otherwise get? And I think that's sort of the question that's we've talked about, and I think people, if you've been following these workshops, are comfortable with what fast start pricing is, what it intends, what issues it intends to solve. But the missing part may be sort of more empirical evidence about is there a large enough problem here to solve that fast start pricing is worth doing in the first place? And
Okay, and
yeah.
going to that, since I have not been following this, I really apologize.
Okay.
What is the problem we're trying to intend to solve here? Just really quickly, because I think I've lost it looking at all these examples.
So the basic idea is that fast start, or the way that the ISO prices today, would essentially assume that this fast start generators in these examples who are needed to meet load in certain intervals are not sort of part of the pool of resources that can be considered in terms of setting the price. And so one might say, well, if the fast start generator is needed in order to meet load, but because of certain restrictions and its physical characteristics, it makes it hard under the market optimization for it to actually set the marginal price, that maybe there's the need for assumptions to allow that fast start resource to set the price. And I'll just mention that this is a concept that is generally accepted among the ISOs, and you probably know we have, among our ISO peers, have the most limited form of this type of pricing.
Yeah, is that in part because we have different mixes? I mean, I really want to look towards the future rather than the past. And, you know, I get it. PJM has lots of multi-stage generators. And so this has been a really, you know, key component of what they want to do. But given, you know, the switchover of our fleet and introduction of storage resources, are we thinking about the future rather than the past here?
Yeah, so those are all on the table, and that's part of the empirical discussion is going to be, you know, to take a look at, you know, what is the magnitude of impact here in terms of pricing, in terms of the types of units that are affected. All those things would need to be looked at. So it's a good question that's sort of unanswered at this point.
Okay, and then let me just try. Are you saying that this would be introduced in the 5-minute market, but not in the 15 or any other market? I mean, does it have no effect on HASP or day ahead? I just want to clarify.
So as far as I know now, it would apply in the RTD and it would apply in FMM, perhaps in a similar, in a different sense. Not all ISOs apply fast start pricing in the day ahead market. And I don't know whether or not at this point we would consider doing that. And I think analysis would bear out whether or not that's necessary. It seems to me to be less necessary in the day ahead space, but given the reason why it's used.
If I could just toss in there, the New York ISO does apply it in the day ahead market, in that it's there. It almost never matters because you have, you know, essentially your fast start resources or your more expensive resources, and you tend to go to them when you have limited other options. And in the day ahead market, you have lots of other options. So it's rare that you actually, you know, schedule those resources. So fast start pricing is technically present there, but practically it doesn't matter.
Got it. Okay. And then, I mean, the way I'm seeing this, it only increases prices. Is that right? It would never decrease prices.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. The fast start generators would only be enabled to set the price and would only have a price impact if their marginal energy offer is above what otherwise would be the marginal unit, and it wouldn't work the other way around.
Okay, so we're only increasing prices, and so is the underlying rationale that this is somehow economic? I mean, we do markets for the benefit of customers and because we get a more efficient dispatch. And so this will increase costs for customers, and in particular CAISO customers, because we're usually net importers. So where's our efficiency gain? What am I getting out of that for my customers?
Yeah, so the cost justification is going to have, and market efficiency is going to have to weigh in discussions about how, you know, bid cost recovery, things like that, how, you know, it's been seen in other markets that, you know, fast start pricing may reduce the amount of uplift that's needed to pay a fast start resource who isn't being compensated through the energy price to stay online and stay participating in the market. And empirical analysis would be needed to show, you know, where the trade-offs lie in terms of how, you know, if there are cost efficiencies to be gained here.
Okay, and you guys will be doing that as part of this initiative. I mean, I can see the argument. We've gone down this path before, like it sends the right economic signals, but given that we mandate that resources be built to meet PRMs, there is no signal that talks about new resources, right? So this is just a transfer of money from one group of customers to another, I would guess.
Yeah, so what's important to take away is that we're not going to be doing this for the sole reason of transferring revenues from consumers to suppliers. But at the end of the day, fast start pricing would need to be associated with sufficient market efficiency and operational efficiency to justify if you're actually getting some operational or market benefit from implementing the fast start pricing to justify a potential transfer of revenue like you're describing, then we can debate those trade-offs. But certainly it's not intended to be, just we're shifting money from consumers to suppliers without any other incremental benefit gained in the market or operationally.
Okay, and can we try to quantify that? Because, one can wave their hands, and I think we need something more than that to, take back to customers who are funding all of these efforts.
Yeah, so we have quite a comprehensive list of metrics that we're looking at in order to answer these questions, and we're taking hints from other ISOs, sort of looking at, what sort of analyses they did to justify to their ratepayers and their boards, fast start pricing back in the day, and we will, the plan is as of right now is to do something like that either in advance of the straw proposal for this initiative or in advance of the introduction of fast start pricing generally within those proposals. So the distinction there is that it may be that we precede a straw proposal with scarcity pricing and other things before fast start pricing becomes part of the formal pricing process. If we feel like we need to move forward on those topics faster, then we can do this sort of empirical.
Okay, and maybe I could get some clarification. So this initiative is also going to include scarcity pricing. So this isn't it. Fast start pricing isn't it? Isn't the sum total of what you're doing here?
Correct. Yeah. So fast start pricing is a component of this initiative. It's been the focus of the workshop so far because it's there were always these lingering questions about, well, is it even possible to have fast start pricing signals in your market without ruining flexible ramping product prices? And that's sort of what today's workshop is about. Here's a mechanism that we could potentially explore.
Oh, okay. I totally misunderstood. I thought, we're having a workshop for this and this is it, fast start pricing. So we're having another workshop about scarcity pricing?
So at this point, there's no plan for a separate workshop on scarcity pricing, only because, in planning this initiative, we put out the issue paper, I think last summer, maybe June or July. And the ideas of scarcity pricing in terms of the things that we thought that we needed to address were a little more concrete. And for fast start pricing, what was different than that is that there was both this question of, like I just said, are we even able to do this sort of mathematically? Can we even input fast start pricing into our market without affecting flexible ramp? And at the same time, there's potentially more justification needed on whether or not, sort of the impact of fast start pricing generally is worth any efficiencies gained. And of course, those same questions need to be asked for scarcity pricing, but we just felt like we had more to do with stakeholders in terms of like educating what is fast start pricing, how does fast start pricing affect marginal prices, and this is what these examples are for.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. I appreciate it.
Thank you. There's a question in the room.
Harry Servideo, GDS Associates. I just wanted to take this opportunity to support the comment that Callie made earlier about the potential price formation inconsistency between the binding and advisory intervals and the impact that may have on the opportunity costs coming forward for energy storage within the RTD horizon. That's a thing that would be nice to see a little bit more information around. The other thing that I wanted to comment on is, and it's sort of related to what Jeff was talking about, And it's just that I feel like as you walk through these examples, all of the right ingredients are here to set up potentially an example where the fast start generator needs to set price in the binding interval when its energy is actually not needed in that binding interval. And I haven't quite fleshed out what that example would look like. I feel like all the right ingredients are there. So it would be good if you all have some insight on that. You know, going back to what Mike said earlier, that such an example would violate that fundamental concept that if the fast start generator is actually needed to flow, then it should be there to set price. So right now it's more of this gut feeling that I have about it, but if you guys have seen examples like that or can provide those, that would be good. Otherwise I can do some work on my side on that. The last, and that's more of a comment. The last question I have is, you know, whenever I start to think about, okay, I should first clarify. So the binding schedules, that is the dispatches that are sent to the generators, those are going to, if I'm understanding this right, those are going to come from the scheduling run, right? Okay.
Yes.
And then the prices in the binding interval are going to come from the pricing run.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know if you guys have put much thought into this aspect, but through history, CAISO has always had an issue when they separated this concept of the pricing from the scheduling, and they haven't made the binding dispatches come from the pricing run. There's always been problems, I think, for the past 10 years, and I think they also came to a head in 2020 as well. So there, just knowing there's always been a problem there, I'm wondering if you have any insight on going back to setting binding dispatches from scheduling run while prices are based on the pricing run, if you foresee those same issues cropping up and maybe some more things that we have to think about more band-aids for.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I don't have more insight other than to say we recognize that, and it's going way back to the first set of workshops, that fast start pricing requires separating physical and pricing dispatch, and that in our market today, as you said, there have been issues with doing that, and I think that's been brought up in the past that like that's an implementation challenge one would need to solve in order to do fast start pricing at all, at least as the way it's considered here. So I don't have any insight into how, like what the issues actually were and how solvable they may be, other than to say we're going to have to overcome that hurdle.
You have a question from Laura. Your line's unmuted. Laura, please make sure to introduce yourself.
Hi, this is Laura Trelease from the Energy Authority. And James, I had a question on, it sounds like in the, in the physical dispatch, in the scheduling run, you're getting, am I understanding this correctly, that you're getting the right FRU and FRD prices, but it's the energy price that you're trying to make sure to allow the fast start generator to set the energy price. And so when you do the ordinary fast start pricing, you get the energy price correct, but if you allow it to impact the FRU and FRD, then you mess up those prices. Is an option to have the scheduling run set the FRU and FRD prices and have the pricing run set the energy price? I don't know if you've looked at that as an option, and I haven't thought it all the way through. Maybe it has its own unintended consequences, but just thinking about maybe another way to crack this nut.
Yeah, so a good comment, and I'm going to say that how you described it is mostly true, and I'm going to pick on one word. And when you said that the physical dispatch calculates the right price for FRU, FRD, so it does calculate the right price under the assumptions that it's given, but so does the alternative fast start pricing. It also calculates the right price under the assumptions it's given, even though they're different prices. So we don't necessarily see, so you're correct in that what the alternative fast start pricing does is it gives you the energy price signal you're looking for under fast start pricing, but maintaining the opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost is what makes the price right for for flexible ramp. It maintains the opportunity cost signal. It's just that between the two examples, because opportunity cost by definition is the difference between the generator's offer and the price that they are exposed, or the binding price, because the fast start pricing signal has increased the price, it's also increased the opportunity cost. So they're both actually setting the right price, even though they're different prices, if that makes sense.
Yep.
If I could follow up, that's actually going to be key to answering the other part of the question too, because what you want is you want to have the FRD and FRU prices consistent with the LMP. So when the LMP goes up, the FRU is nothing. The FRD goes up. If you were to grab the FRUND prices from the physical dispatch while getting the LMP from the pricing dispatch, then since they're coming from two different places, there's no reason why they'd have to be consistent with each other, and so you'd get incentives for people to do things that we would rather not have them.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Kathleen Colbert from Vistra, you're next.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I actually was going to follow up on Michelle and your back and forth. So apologies that I'm taking us back a second, but I just wanted, and it's off topic of fast start pricing. I'm listening, Vistra participates in most of the FERC jurisdictional markets and some of those that, they have fast start pricing. So we have a lot of experience with it. And so we'll look to see how this unfolds and provide feedback in the future. But for right now, James, I did want to let you, and maybe this didn't come out clearly in our prior workshops, but the scarcity pricing and improvements to price formation in general, I think, at least as where we stand today, are more important to us than this particular element of the full initiative. The other thing to make crystal is we have a proposal of where we'd like to see the scarcity pricing start. And so we anticipated there to be a stakeholder workshop where stakeholders could provide their ideas of where to go with the market design to address some of these known scarcity pricing issues. I just think the project and the process will go more smoothly if you have a workshop in the beginning to allow us to do that, rather than on rolling out just the CAISO's ideas and then getting feedback. It's just a suggestion in case you want to consider that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I'm getting some thumbs up in the room to voice their approval of that, and we'll certainly take that back. And I'm so just two comments. Of course, a scarcity pricing workshop is doable, and we're trying to balance, the need to take this time to get stakeholders familiar with concepts before diving into actual policy work, which may, arguably also be necessary for scarcity pricing. So we'll think about that some more. But I also want to emphasize a little that I'm not sure this is your takeaway, but I don't want one to take away from these workshops that have been focused on fast start pricing to assume that the ISO thinks that fast start pricing is necessarily a higher priority than scarcity pricing or a lower equal priority. It's only in the sense that we thought there might have been less general knowledge about principally what fast start pricing is and mechanically how it works. And also it lends itself a little more naturally to basic discussions about price formation than scarcity pricing does. And so we've been using that fast start pricing both as an educational tool for general price formation principles, but also to help people learn a little bit about the mechanics and principles of fast start pricing before going into policy work. So it's not intended to represent necessarily its relative priority amongst the various items in the initiative.
No, and thank you, James, for that clarification and not reading into it. Appreciate you doing all this education. We do think that there's still a lot of education on scarcity pricing. I don't think that maybe folks are familiar with ERCOT's design, but that's some of the pieces that we want to bring forward and provide education on, comes from other markets. I know for a fact a lot of folks are not familiar with the idea of a stop loss mechanism or circuit breaker, some of us call it, and are less familiar with reliability deployment price adders. So if that isn't like, oh yeah, I know exactly what those things are, then I do think we've got a lot of education just across the board. But thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, we've exhausted our questions, but I do have one more slide, so we'll see if that generates any more discussion. I'm really appreciative of all the feedback today. It's been awesome. Okay, slide 41. So 2 small bullets, and one of them is a repeat. So one discussion point I wanted to highlight here is that, in some of the earlier workshops, we described that fast start pricing, as it's applied in other markets, oftentimes requires side payments in the form of lost opportunity cost, or in some markets, it's seen as penalties applied to incentivize resources to follow their dispatch. It seems to be, in the examples that we've played with so far, that the flexible ramping product payments seem to be sufficient to incent following dispatch. And so there wouldn't be this concept of sort of multiple side payments needed to incentivize resources to follow dispatch. So that's something we wanted to point out. And then again, I'll highlight this slide again. These examples do not incorporate commitment costs into the LMPs via modified offer curves for the fast start generator. And so, the concepts here applied are only using one of the 2 assumptions that traditionally fast start pricing entails, which is the minimum output relaxation. But we can build in from this point, if one wanted to incorporate commitment costs into LMPs, how that might be done, and to test some examples there. So that may be a foreshadowing of another workshop. We'll have to talk internally to see where we go from there, but just wanted to make that clear. Okay, that's all the material I had, so we'll take a last call for questions or feedback.
No more questions. Oh, yeah, we do have a question. Just popped up. Let's go ahead and mute.
Hi, this is Sybil from PGP. Just keying off of some of the prior comments from Jeff and the CPUC there. I do think it would be helpful to, in the next phase of the analysis here, to show some of the bid cost recovery impacts. I know that sometimes that's stated as an objective of fast start pricing, as to that you would see some reduction in bid cost recovery, and you're pushing more of that directly into the price signal. So I think it would help make the examples a little bit more complete.
Thank you. Yep. So it's definitely within the range of what we're looking at in terms of empirical analysis, is to evaluate in actually a lot of different ways how fast start pricing may impact uplift, both in terms of sort of total reduction in uplift, or I guess I should say total change in uplift, but also in the concept of, what percent or what proportion of resources require uplift almost exclusively in order to, maintain its revenue sufficiency in order to stick around in the market. And so those are just 2 examples, but it's definitely, something that we'll be looking at doing.
Great, thank you.
I don't see any more questions in queue unless there's any in the room. Okay, I guess we can go ahead and wrap.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, Alva just popped.
Oh, okay.
Let's go ahead and get Alva.
Yeah, just one other thought here. I mean, a lot of this has really been helpful for me in terms of understanding better flexible ramping, but it also points when you talk about applying this day ahead, it makes me realize that imbalance reserves are really a totally different product from flexible ramping, and some of the analogies that are being drawn between the two products may not be entirely correct. So it's just an offshoot of the great information that you provided here, Jeff.
Yep. Thanks, Alba.
Do have one more slide.
Oh, okay. Wait, before I close my portion, I want to thank everybody in the room for attending and those on the phone that provided feedback. And special thanks to Gabe and Guillermo and of course, Mike, who's helped color commentate and answer some questions. So appreciate your time, Mike. And it's almost dinner. It must be past dinner time on the East Coast. So hopefully we can get you out of here.
Michelle, can you make me presenter really quick? Awesome. So for the last. Oh, thank you. So our next steps is just having this presentation available as well as the previous workshops for everyone to review and see. We'll keep everyone in the loop for the future presentations that we may have as well. I want to go over a quick slide on here. It's not going to show up on here really quick, but 1 second. But we can go ahead and it's not, my computer's not working. So we did have like a slide about the energy blog, and this is just pretty much highlighting our blog that we had posted. Hopefully we can see it, but this blog, we add blogs every so often, but this one is for the interconnections from Neil Miller, our vice president. So feel free to subscribe as well. Look at the blog if you have a chance, but as of now, let's go ahead and close our meeting, Michelle. Thanks everyone for joining, and we will look forward to seeing you soon. Okay.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.